Between 1600 and 1629, the Swedes faced one of the most successful cavalry forces of the early modern period, the Polish Winged Hussars. During the Polish-Swedish Wars, the Swedes suffered many humiliating defeats on their behalf, until in 1621 things changed. Gustavus Adolphus entered the stage. He found innovative ways to combat the Polish horsemen and learned a great deal from them. This is how contemporary historiography explains how Gustavus Adolphus dealt with the Polish Winged Hussars. On the 17th of August 1621, the Swedish army, numbering 17,000 men, set foot on Polish-Lithuanian ground. 12 days later, they were at Riga, a city with a population 3 times as large as that of Sweden's capital, Stockholm. Due to the fact that many Polish troops were busy fighting on other fronts, the Swedes encountered little resistance and captured the city on the 25th of September, less than a month after they had arrived at the city. Historian Robert Frost notes, quote, "Its capture began the stunning series of victories which by 1648 had catapulted Sweden from relative obscurity on Europe's northern fringe into the heart of European politics." End quote. The key to this sudden rise of Sweden was Gustavus's reformed army. He deployed smaller units, which were very flexible. He increased the number of pikemen to musketeers to defend against cavalry, and replaced the older arquebuses with newer muskets. His methods proved effective, as the Swedish army seriously challenged the Polish Winged Hussars between 1626 and 1629 in an impressive series of battles, such as those at Walchów, Mewe, Dirschau and Gorzno. Let's first look at the Battle of Mewe. The Polish were besieging the city, held by a Swedish garrison, when the Swedish relief force under Gustavus Adolphus arrived at the scene. The battle consisted of several encounters across multiple days. On the 22nd of September, the first day of the battle, the fight went back and forth, but eventually the Polish Hussars beat the Swedish cavalry on the flanks. However, when the Hussars, who were hampered by trenches covering the battlefield, charged the Swedish infantry, they were beaten back. On the 29th of September, 2 other attacks, one near the village of Gronowo and one on the main fighting ground, were repelled by Swedish musket and artillery fire as well. By the 1st of October, the Hussars were so demoralized that the Polish king Sigismund only persuaded them with great difficulty to charge the Swedish foot once more. However, as the Swedes attacked the Polish position, the Hussars swept the first Swedish line off the high ground. But their assault was again halted by a salvo from the Swedish second line. The Hussars were again forced to withdraw in this order. At nightfall, the siege was finally lifted and the Polish retreated to Gdansk. Some of Gustavus' success against the Polish was owed to the introduction of better muskets, which replaced arquebuses as the main Swedish firearm. It was not much the musket's greater range which mattered, but its increased penetration. The Hussars now faced modern muskets produced in the Netherlands with a caliber of 18 to 22 mm, using a charge of 35 grams. That was sufficient to pierce body armor. When fired by 3 ranks simultaneously in 1 or 2 salvos, this improved musket was very effective and caused great consternation among the Hussars. Still, the musket itself does not sufficiently explain the Swedish success. Much of it was actually owed to their strategy of avoiding any encounter on terrain that was favorable to cavalry. Moreover, they always dug themselves in and fortified their positions and field fortifications. One particularly interesting tool was the Swedish feather, a combination of a musket fork and stakes which archers already used in the Middle Ages to deter cavalry from charging them. Robert Frost summarizes the Swedish strategy mockingly, quote, "They began digging at Riga and did not stop digging until Altmark." End quote. Polish mutterings in the 1620s against the Swedish moles, who refused to come out and fight in the open, attest to this situation. The next major encounter was at Dirschau from the 17th to the 18th of August 1627. This battle demonstrated that the Swedes learned from the Polish. Gustavus Adolphus confronted Stanisław Kogniak-Polski, a renowned Polish commander who took command of the Polish army after arriving from Ukraine in November 1626. Dirschau is sometimes cited as the first occasion on which the Swedish cavalry defeated the Polish Hussars in open battle. They charged home against the Hussars with sabres and proved that they could now meet the Poles on more or less equal terms. However, Frost says, quote, "This is to overstate the case," end quote. He explains that on the first day of the battle, Kogniak Polski was outnumbered and therefore not going to be tempted into a hasty engagement by Gustavus Adolphus. Gustavus had been sending out skirmishers to lure the Polish into charging at his carefully prepared infantry positions. To the contrary, Kogniak Polski himself tried to draw the Swedes out from behind their fieldworks. After 2 hours of fruitless waiting, the Polish began to withdraw along a narrow causeway through the marshy ground, which lay between them and their camp. At this point, Gustavus Adolphus caught them on the wrong foot with a surprise attack of his cavalry. In the resulting confusion, the two Polish columns were pushed into the marsh, before a powerful salvo from the Polish foot and a flank attack by some horsemen stopped the Swedes in their tracks. The sources disagree on the outcome of the battle. From a victory of the Swedes to a draw or a Polish victory, everything was reported. This is a nice example for a genuine historiographical problem. We can't always trust our sources. We have to deal with propaganda, misunderstandings, and intentional misinformation. In our case, all the sources about Dirschau really tell us is the implicit nationalistic biases of contemporary commentators. This is to say, Swedes write one story, Polish another, each just for their own nation. Because of these conflicting accounts, recent scholarship tends to look at the events in the aftermath of the battle in order to determine who won. Most scholars conclude that the Swedes had the edge because they advanced while the Polish retreated. Whatever the case may be, Dirschau merely confirmed the Poles' inclination to avoid open battles against the Swedish moles. After Mewe and Dirschau, it was clear to the Polish that they could no longer rely on one shattering victory to end conflicts like earlier at Kirchholm in 1605 or Klushino in 1610. Gustavus Adolphus had turned battles into long attritional affairs, which the Swedes, with their superior firepower, were more likely to win. Despite the humiliating experience at Dirschau, it was clear that the Polish cavalry was superior both in terms of quantity and quality. But even if a superior cavalry force by itself was no longer sufficient to decide battles, it could still play a decisive role in campaign. Infantry was still vulnerable to cavalry outside prepared fieldworks. It was especially exposed on the march, where its firepower was severely blunted because of the shortcomings of matchlocks. Taking into account that marches usually took several hours, matches burned relatively quickly, about 10 to 15 centimeters per hour. So, to avoid wasting the matches, only every 10th soldier on the march kept their match alit. When facing an attack, it took a lot of time to light all the matches. This meant infantry on the march was a tempting target for cavalry. Gustavus Adolphus soon realized he needed archers to provide protection. Meanwhile, the Swedes learned to fight the Polish way. In 1628, the Polish were besieging Strasbourg. Near Gorzno, the Polish met the Swedish relief army. The Swedes deployed 3,400 cavalrymen, which was half of their entire force. This 50-50 split between cavalry and infantry was very similar to a Polish army. The Swedes under Wrangel won the battle by a decisive flanking maneuver. The Polish infantry lacked pikes and wasn't protected by field fortifications, which added to their disadvantage. However, the Swedes could not exploit this victory because they did not bring enough artillery to besiege a city. This shows a general problem with fighting the Polish way. It was not that cavalry or the hussars became useless, but Polish armies often lacked artillery and infantry to exploit their victories. The Polish, meanwhile, exploited their advantage and restricted the Swedish movements which would have been necessary for supplying and feeding their army. Constant raids behind the Swedish lines caused problems and hunger in the Swedish army. Using their superior mobility, the Polish also controlled the reinforcement stream of mercenaries to a large degree. In April 1627, for example, they surrounded 2,500 German mercenaries on their way to join the Swedes at Hammerstein. Some agreed to enter Polish service, others were sent home. This frustrating cat-and-mouse game continued into the 1629 campaign, when the Swedes were again defeated by the Polish at Honigfelde. By the way, in this case, Swedish historians often downplayed the gravity of this defeat for the Swedish army. However, this victory was not only important for the morale of the Polish, but also a quite severe defeat for Gustavus. So, even if the Swedes could now stand up to the Polish, this is most likely not to be attributed to pike and shot tactics alone. Gustavus' success also relied on cavalry charging home armes blanches. That is military jargon and means that they charged enemies with their melee weapons instead of skirmishing with pistols. Gustavus imitated and adopted Polish tactics to some degree, which he demonstrated so spectacularly at the battles of Breitenfeld and Lützen during the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War. But this is a topic for another video.